You need to start thinking about it, quite frankly, once a project has been sort of identified, gone through a feasibility stage where you understand what the scope of the project is, what the goals of the project are, and what your timeline is, what the facility's timeline is to get this project implemented, to have that first patient in a bed. You need to start early on thinking about commissioning. Is certainly one of those aspects that once you develop your systems, you've got to be thinking about who you're bringing on to do the commissioning and what the extent of that commissioning is going to be. And during selection of those systems, the BAS system in particular, you need to understand, where are you going to get the most bang for the buck, and do you have, and you see this in rural systems also, do you have a workforce that is able to manage that, the technology that you're going to need to run this facility?
There's a major crisis facing healthcare facilities management. We have aging employees, aging buildings, and aging infrastructure. We've created the Healthcare Facilities Network, a content network designed specifically to help solve for these three pressing issues in healthcare facilities management. We bring on thought leaders and experts from across healthcare facilities management, all the way from the C-suite to the technician level, because at the end of the day, we're all invested in solving the aging issue. Thanks for tuning in. Look at our videos. You will find that as a theme across our content. This is the Healthcare Facilities Network. I'm your host, Peter Martin. I'm actually joined today by two of my CREF colleagues. We are going to be talking about transitioning to hospital operations. That's our topic. But before we delve into that area, I'm going to ask my two guests to please introduce themselves to you.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Again, it's a pleasure to be on the show again. Patrick Murphy, I'm the regional president here in the East for CREF.
Thank you. I'm Steve Van Ness. I'm Vice President of Planning, Design, and Instruction for the Eastern Region of CREF.
Excellent. Here on the Healthcare Facilities Network, we made it a mission to help try to solve our threefold problems: aging buildings, aging infrastructure, and aging employees. And as we talked about transitioning to operations, these two gentlemen are out there on the front lines, working with clients, dealing with the issues that come up on a daily basis. And that's why there's no better guests to have on than Steve, who's been an architect for more than 40 plus years, Patrick, who's been in project management, construction, leadership development. So let's just start. It's a huge topic, and we're not going to cover everything in a day. I mean, transition to operations, but let's tie the transition to operations directly into not only aging employees, but the lack of people coming into the field with hospital experience. When you have people who are not experiencing project management in healthcare and transitioning in a hospital to operations, what are some of the ramifications for that? And I throw that out to either one of you who wants to pick the ball and roll.
Yeah, I mean, why don't I just start the framework, because it is a very large topic. Like we were just talking before this, there's a lot of different work streams that you can focus in on. But tying it to, the pillars of what we think are the biggest crisis right now in healthcare, right? The revolving door of people is very, very challenging for a project, as everybody knows, right? If you're doing a college project and one of the kids flex out in the middle, you got to keep going on the project, or you might get a replacement, and that replacement needs to get kind of brought up to speed, and it can be a disruption. And transitioning to operations, people think starts, when a project is getting near its completion, right? And that isn't when it starts. It starts well before breaking ground on a project. Oftentimes, the planning, the folks and the users that are involved with planning a project, whether it's a big improvement, tenant improvement, renovation, ground up project in a hospital, you need to start planning that very, very early. And a lot of times it takes multiple years. And we know, and we've talked about it in other episodes, that folks don't stick around at the same place for, more than 3 or 4 or 5 years anymore. And oftentimes you're going to get a big revolving door in these projects. And it affects all the work streams to transition to operations. So I think that's one big one that we can focus on. I have pet peeves, just like you said, we're on the front line now. And, there's concerns that I didn't have 10 years ago when I see a project that we do now, based on other factors, right? The way partnerships are currently being created to create more creative funding sources, brings developers into the picture more and more in the hospital world today than it did even 5 or 10 years ago. And oftentimes those development pro formas, which are basically the budget to get stabilized to move on to the next development, don't always align with the amount of training, the amount of planning for move management, getting equipment installed, training on the equipment that was installed. All of that can become problematic. Commissioning, you name it. It becomes very, very problematic when you have stakeholders that don't necessarily have the same end goal. They may have the initial goal together, and the charter could be aligned. But if one stakeholder is focusing on not just the first patient, but the next 10 years of patients, and another constituent is focused on finishing what they've needed to be part of that development phase, you can get into a trick from a funding perspective and just staying on site to make sure that things are done. And so that's one side of the coin. And then the other side of the coin is the operators themselves. Like we said, it's a revolving door. And I think all work streams associated with transition to operations are impacted by that.
Steve? Yeah, so just taking off on what Patrick had to say, when I look at it, I look at this specific aspect of the transition to the operations. There's sort of two different focuses here. One is the clinical side of the operations, where the design team has gone to a great deal of effort throughout the design process to design around an operational goal of how patients are going to flow, how they're going to provide care, how the supply chain works with that, how housekeeping works with that, how even food services works with that. And those goals may be not remembered during the transition to operations, largely because the staff who set up those operational workflows are no longer there, or they have a short memory. And that always, so there's always, in this full transition to operations, there's always a period of where if you really need to be sitting down and maximizing the extent to which your actual operational flow is working with what the design intent and what the goals of the organization were. So that's where a couple of things come into play. One is staff turnover. The other is you need the time to actually orient people and get the operational flow worked out. You need that time. Oftentimes with a developer, you're not going to get that time, so that gets cut short. On the operational side, that becomes it's a somewhat more complex problem in that you've got a couple of things going on. One is the increasingly complex technology that is being used in building systems, building automation systems, and the aging workforce is sometimes not prepared to deal with that level of technology. The inexperienced workforce coming in maybe does not have the right training to adequately make use of that technology. So in one sense, you've got that kind of staff turnover that makes the commissioning phase or makes the transition to operational phase a little more challenging. The other piece is a lot of the commissioning that happens right now really happens, it's sort of vendor specific. So you've got the guy who installed the chiller system and the guy who maintains the existing plant, and the chiller system, the guy comes in and he explains his system and how it works, and maybe if you're lucky, how it ties into the building automation system. But what you don't get is that overview of how everything is working together. And that ends up resulting in operational costs, inefficiency, breakdowns, all of that. So it's really, in that whole process, you need to have both the design engineer involved to help keep that overview of the system and the commissioning agent involved. It's not just the vendors that should be doing the training for the operational side.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the old adage is the last 10% of a project takes 90% of the time. This is kind of one of the reasons that old folklore came up, is there is so much to do in that short period of time.
Let me ask a baseline question that I should have asked first. We have the traditional design phase, right? SD, the schematic design, conceptual into schematic into DD, design doc. Where in, like, for somebody who's new to healthcare, maybe new to project management, because as you guys have said, they're out there, where should the transition to operations, where in the traditional project management timeline should folks start to think about this? And Patrick, I know you said up front, start to think about the transition to operations, and more than that, start to plan for the transition to operations. I'm assuming it's not in the last 10% of the project work. Where should it go?
No, it's funny. Steve and I were chatting about it this morning, and Steve, if you're welcome to chat through this, because as the planner, he's going to probably, I'm not going to go early enough, and he's going to be able to probably give you where it should start.
And Steve, I would ask you to do that, but also at the end, have you seen this timeline slip over the years where it happens later than it should? What have you kind of seen as far as this transition to operations timeline staying, slipping, moving up? What have you compare it historically, if you would?
So you need to start thinking about it, quite frankly, once a project has been sort of identified, gone through a feasibility stage where you understand what the scope of the project is, what the goals of the project are, and what your timeline is, what the facility's timeline is to get this project implemented, to have that first patient in a bed. You need to start early on thinking about commissioning. Is certainly one of those aspects that once you develop your systems, you've got to be thinking about who you're bringing on to do the commissioning and what the extent of that commissioning is going to be. And during selection of those systems, the BAS system in particular, you need to understand, where are you going to get the most bang for the buck? And do you have, and you see this in rural systems all the time, do you have a workforce that is able to manage that, the technology that you're going to need to run this facility? So yes, I have seen this slip numerous times where not enough time has been devoted to thinking about that up front, where you get to the end of the project and everybody's focused on move management, which is certainly a component of transition to operations, but it is only one component. It's really having the staff trained and understanding how they're going to use the facility, how they're going to use the equipment, how they're going to maintain the equipment, how maintenance of that equipment ties into the regulatory requirements in terms of reporting for CMS and whomever, and understanding the regulatory and the licenses and certifications that are required. The construction manager at a large project, he's going to want to know that upfront. I recently was talking to a construction manager, and he had the best experience he'd ever had on an accelerated project because at the very outset they started thinking about what the process for transition to operations was going to be, things that he had never thought about. They had a nuclear medicine facility in there. And they had to get rid of nuclear waste, so you need a special license for that. And nobody had ever thought of that. So it's thinking through all of those issues as well up front. So I think the sooner you can get started, the better. Obviously, maybe not day one, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But up front, I know you're going to jump in before you jump in.
You know me well.
I know. I had to beat the punch. Steve, you mentioned something that's near and dear to my heart coming out of the recruiting world a year and a half ago. You talked about people and the ability of local staff to manage during the operational phase. Do you think that it doesn't, number one, does it happen? And do you think that more hospitals need to consider this? You know, when you're in that transition to operation, what equipment are we getting? What's the capacity of our staff to handle it? Can we get the staff to handle it? Does that need to be a consideration very early on?
It needs to be a consideration very early on, and where you want to go with your facilities management program in terms of increasing automation, increasing, the use of AI, increasing technology. You need to have those goals very clear, and how to get to those goals very clear in your mind as you get into the design phase. Because if you don't, then you're going to end up with a mismatch between, this beautiful new building, and people who don't have the skill sets, to manage that building and operate that building.
And to you, Patrick, how often do you find, you go into a client and they might have this great technology, but they're not using it because they don't know how to use it efficiently?
Well, it happens all the time. I mean, there's a big wave, right? There's two waves, right? There's the generational wave and there's a technology wave. And they're right behind one another. And new generations don't have the right ship for either one of the swells right now. So, I could even say, oftentimes we as CREF, we go in and we do a lot of asset validation and we digitize a lot of information, basically a big spreadsheet, a big database that we can then give back to the client or the organization to have them be able to utilize the software and the technology that they're oftentimes procuring through their information systems and technology budget through a different controller, right? And we're finding now that, the facilities teams are the ones that are on that other end of that rope. And oftentimes big decisions on what technology to purchase are done not in a vacuum. I wouldn't say it's in a vacuum, but without fully educating the folks that are going to be operating the train, and it kind of goes twofold, right? We do a lot right now in existing facilities, occupied facilities, which takes a lot more time and effort to pop ceiling tiles in occupied rooms, to be able to identify all of the data that actually doesn't harvest itself to get into these systems. But I think it's more pertinent today with the conversation we're having about transitioning to operations in a new program or a new building, that, it's the same conversation. It's all right. Well, we're installing all of this equipment, right? Some of the equipment's being furnished by the construction manager. Some of it's being procured by a planner or by purchasing, right? It could be general equipment. It could be medical equipment. And all of that information goes into the building physically. And, we aren't fully there yet where all of that data, which is actually built in to the building, like, new houses, if you buy a new refrigerator, you can get all of that metadata and you can load it into something. Maybe it's an app on your phone, like the little rental property I have in Wellfleet. I can see it now.
I was going to say, you sound like you're speaking from experience.
If anyone would like, I do have time available in Wellfleet in September. You can cut that. I'm not selling that right now, or leave it in. But my point being that you have all of these assets, thousands of assets that come in on a new project. And nowhere in that process does that data go into their CMMS system, right? It may be in a brand new BAS, building automation system, but very often this very highly technological building is basically left to the groups to operate in with a very short window of training. But all of those preventative maintenance schedules, all of that operational information, everything that the manufacturer would suggest is actually sitting there. And in transition to operations, yet another workflow, is making sure all that information gets digitized into the brand new Ferrari of a software system that was purchased. And more often than not, today, that's overlooked.
One of the very frequent problems with any transition to operations is making sure that the IT team is on board and making sure that all of their systems and their brand new, all the bells and whistles software packages are running properly, and that the people who actually have to use those systems are trained to use those and understand how they work and how they integrate. I think if there's one single problem most often seen in the transition that slows us down, it's the IT folks weren't engaged early enough or as deeply engaged as they need to have been to get that facility turned over quickly.
If you like this video, please like and subscribe to the network. And more importantly, share it with your colleagues in the healthcare industry. Together, we can solve the aging crisis that's impacting all of us. There are organizations we talk to where we'll talk to the FM team and they'll tell us that they still don't have a seat at the table. They're siloed. You have your PDC department who's running it. They're turning it over to FM. But FM's not getting that seat at the table. They're not invited. And I'm shocked that it still exists out there. But does you have no shot, do you, at a smooth transition to operations if you're bringing in facilities at the last moment?
No shot at all. I'm seeing it less frequently now than in years past, particularly as the projects get more and more complex and as the reliance on EAS systems, for example, but as the reliance on technology becomes greater and greater, it's, I think, a lot more of the clients that I've been dealing with have realized that. Or perhaps it's because I insist on it.
Oh, that's why you bring in somebody even when they're doing.
But no, it has been a problem in the past, and as I said, I am seeing a little less of it now. But if they don't have a seat at the table during the design, I think you're on your way to having real challenges once you try to get the system, once you try to get the building, renovation, the department, whatever it is, who can run it.
I think the irony is they're the ones that only have a true seat at a table in the building. It's usually in their desk. But yeah, I think ultimately Steve's right. You know, there's, I think as the process becomes leaner, I think you're seeing a shift in how projects get delivered, where we're bringing in subcontractors, subconsultants. We're bringing in different members of the team during the team assembly phase earlier because of the change, the pedagogy, and how we actually build them. That's a word of the day. Ooh, Ovid works. Somebody fact check that. But the point is, you know, if you have a good facilitator that can literally bring the right people to the table at the right time, like make sure you have user meetings at the front end, right? Once you have a basis of design, Steve and I were talking about it today, you've got to make sure that you have a pointed agenda and you get the right people in early. Just like we're starting to do, like, again, we're bringing in, you know, plumbing trades, mechanical trades, electrical trades in concept nowadays with the lean approach. We've got to continue to do that, bring the technology fold to the table early, which is not just is the IT groups internally. It's also, in some cases, again, with the aging issue and the rapid turnover and the revolving door, there are consultants out there just like we help with representing owners to manage the project in its overall way. There's folks that can help augment where there's a short staff. IT, facilities, got to have the meetings, got to have somebody that knows what it's going to be like to sit in that desk. And again, like Steve said, it's very hard to operate a new building. It's even harder to have to operate a new building in an old building on two different systems with less people. So, yeah.
So I like simple things. People like simple things. And let's keep this at a high level. And Steve, you alluded to one, but for somebody who's embarking on this journey or starting out, or maybe they're, again, new to healthcare, what do you see Steve, you talked about IT, but what are the gotchas that you have frequently seen clients or systems make? And when I say gotchas, errors, gotchas is a good word. What are some of the most common errors that you see are made and what people should avoid?
I think commissioning is a big one. I think after, like you said, after you have the basis of design, you got to get going with your commissioning agent. You got to get going with your facility staff, your IT staff. I think equally as important is planning medical equipment and planning specifically medical equipment, imaging equipment. You had mentioned earlier, Steve, if you have specific imaging equipment, there's a whole regulatory workflow that needs to go along with that. That's a got you moment. I don't know how many times you've had to race to Watertown to get an X-ray tube certified, and that takes a long time. I think ultimately it's the gotcha moment happens when you put the project on tilt. And what I mean by that, and we started on this, is if you're going in very, very quickly and you're trying to maintain budget, you're going to have a hard time transitioning to operations well. It's, what do they say? There's scope, there's schedule, there's budget. You can really try to get 2 out of 3, but one of them has to give. And if it's something that is tight on budget, and the scope is very specific, you got to give the time on the front end. And otherwise, you're going to need, if it's a fast job, you got to bring in folks to help do the work we just mentioned, both post certificate of occupancy and well before certificate of occupancy, and then again all the way back into concept.
And another thing that I reminded of when you in your discussion, Patrick, is, and it seems like it should be very basic and everybody should know this by now, but I still continue to see it, which is you need to involve a lot of the operational departments in your user meeting and in your project planning up front. I don't know how many times I've seen folks ignore housekeeping. Meetings with your environmental services staff are key because, quite frankly, a typical user group in a hospital will consist of nurses, maybe an administrator, and a couple of doctors, care providers. And they don't really, a lot of them don't pay attention to how the waste gets out, how the things get in. The primary example I use is the doctor who wants to show up in the OR, and all he knows is his instrument table is right there and it's all set for him. What happens before or after it got to that position is really not his business. He just wants to know that. So, I think getting all of those support operational departments involved very early is key. I know it sounds really basic, but I still see it not happening in a lot of this.
Why does it still happen, Steve?
Couple of reasons. Speed to market is probably the primary one. I don't want to have all these user meetings. We know how to design this. Typically led by, a physician or an administrator who has a physician background. They have a sense, as I said, that they know how everything operates. So they should know how to do it. If you're trying to get a project done fast, the user meetings take time. You're dealing with people who may not understand floor plans, so you have to take the time to explain to them. Sometimes you have to do mock-ups, but you need to have all those folks involved. Supply chain has become increasingly critical. Where before it wasn't, you would provide them with a couple of storerooms and you size them adequately according to the guidelines and you're by. Not anymore. Supply chain, given the situation right now in the country post-pandemic, it's a critical one to have involved throughout.
No, I couldn't agree more.
Commissioning. You guys mentioned it. Do you find that clients don't commission critical spaces as well, EDs, ORs? And why, when you see folks not commissioning, Why don't they commission? What's their reason for it?
Well, I'll try to thread it with the conversation we just had, which is the human condition is not one that is additive. So I say the cupcake analogy all the time. A cupcake is just egg, sugar, flour, water, vanilla extract. How hard could it be?
Yep.
It only becomes hard when you have to come back from Stop and Shop 3 times. And then you'll realize that some of those ingredients you didn't think were important are important for the cupcake to rise, right? So I think ultimately, commissioning is very similar, where you will oftentimes, at least the human condition, I believe, is it's a budgeted item. It's been in a pro forma. It's set and it's on rails. And if you don't have it in the budget, oftentimes you just commission what's called the big iron, which is the air handling units and the chiller system, right? And that is not commissioning with a capital C, what we like to say. That's all systems that are either critical or life safety. It could be security, it could be generators, it could be equipment. I mean, commissioning is a bigger word than what we've evolved it into in our business. It is not something where somebody just comes out with a checklist and he just says, yep, that started up. All right, let's go to the next one. Or she says, all right, I need you to show me the sequence of operations. It needs to be thorough, and it oftentimes they're engaged in the planning. So as early as you can get them in there at spec level, which is when they specify it, you want to have them in there because they're going to help inform you that the security system may be tied to the cooling system, right? So all that work to get like an economizer or something that can create savings for electricity and things, it may be tied to occupancy, which are tied to lighting switches. You don't always know. You got to know what you don't know in the front end. And I think, again, we see specifically on not hospitals, big hospital systems that do have a facilities team, but where you're in a freestanding ED or a micro hospital or a surgery center, oftentimes, and I don't mean to say this developers are very vital to getting funding and partnering to get projects completed specifically today. But at the end of the day, those specific components for commissioning require not only bringing the commissioning agent on, but also the users we just discussed, and doing it very early. And that takes time. You'd rather do it during planning because everybody is under pressure. When you're trying to get all the right permits and building card sign-offs, and you're worried about the deliveries coming through the front door and where to warehouse all of the booms and the stretchers and the beds, that is not the time to be thinking about what needs to be commissioned or not, because it all works together and it's all getting interwoven with all the sustainability initiatives we have now to try to, reduce the amount of electricity we're using.
Steve, how have you seen the approach to commissioning change over the years?
I think that it's more in depth than it has been. I think it is still, unfortunately, mostly vendor driven, which tends to put it in silos rather than sort of an overview, an integrated look at how a facility actually functions.
So that's a really good point. When you say it's mostly vendor driven, what does that mean?
I mean, generally you'll have commissioning around the specific systems that you have, and but what happens when you get training, the training is the part that's vendor driven.
Okay.
So you will have the Philips vendor come in and show you how to run their particular cath equipment, right? But how that ties into other pieces of equipment that are there, how it ties into the VAS system, any of that is sort of ignored. It's actually more even more critical when you're talking about mechanical systems and VAS systems, because they might be two different vendors there. So you've got training, on the one end by the guy who put the air handling in, and the other end by the guy who has the BAS system. But you don't have sort of, well, how do these work? How do these actually work together?
Yeah, I think just think of the general term for commissioning, right? You can commission artwork. You can commission an aircraft carrier. It's a point in time where you're giving the reins over, and you need to feel really comfortable with giving those reins over, right? And I think that's the piece that we've lost. We now are just checking to make sure a piece of equipment functions and a certain group are trained, but that is after the fact. There's a lot of learning that goes into the planning. Planning in itself is a way to help educate folks on what they're actually doing.
If you want to be a guest on a future episode of the Healthcare Facilities Network, go to healthcarefacilitiesnetwork.com and let us know who you are and what you want to talk about, because together we can solve this critical aging issue.